Hello, thank you for joining us today for a Methods webinar. I am joined today with Antonio Nieto-Rodriguez. He is currently calling in from Brussels. He actually also resides in Spain. He's the author of The Project Revolution. Our course in Methods is Methods of Strategic Projects. He's a director of project management at GlaxoSmithKline Vaccines, and he has been called Thinker of the Month by Thinkers 50. Thank you for joining us today, Antonio. Good to see you.
Thank you, Janice. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So tell me, in the past year, how have you seen the shift to mostly remote work change the way we manage projects?
Well, I think we've all experienced now remote project management. Some months ago, before the crisis, I was talking to an event and say, yeah, virtual project management, they're always more challenging. You need to communicate more. You need to be more flexible on your schedules. And a few months later, we were there. So I think it has really shown us that we can do projects virtually, that we don't need to be all the time present and physically. So I think we've learned that we can do a lot. It's just more complicated in terms of establishing that trust that we normally have when we see people, when we connect with people. Oh, bless you. And so, yes, I think we are now in a virtual world, and it is great for project management, and we are all seeing the benefits of also working from home and having a bit more time for ourselves.
So, how has the entire definition of project management shifted over the past year, and how has it remained the same through the addition of virtual?
Well, I think project management, there was an urgent need to reinvent it. Project management basically has not changed much since it was first kind of professionalized in 1960s, 70s. So I feel very strongly that we had to reinvent it to find ways to update to make it more actual. Of course, Agile and the Agile movement was a big change in the world of projects in 2001, 2002, and years after. I do still think that projects are essential, that you cannot say, well, now we do everything agile. That's wrong. I think companies will still need to do digital transformation, expansions, and so on. So project management, what needs to change is that we need to make it more actual, more simple, for example. We need to also focus much more on value creation. How can we accelerate the creation of value? And a great example, of course, is the development of the vaccine, of the COVID vaccine. These are projects that in the past would take 10, 12, 15 years, and nobody would have ever thought that you could do it in a tenth of that time. You can do it in 10 months. So yes, we've seen the modern project management in action, where you put the bigger picture, the bigger purpose into the driving seat, and we want to, yeah, do everything around making that thing happen, which in our case was the vaccine.
So that's a really interesting example too, because the last time we spoke, you talked about some of the organizations that were having more success at the beginning of the COVID crisis were using those fundamental project management designs versus just staying nimble and flexible each day. Can you speak to that and how that ongoing has happened this year?
Well, I think we saw two sides of the same coin in that kind of area. We saw how R&D departments, how companies that were competing against each other, how regulators and governments work together to uh, in those projects, amazing projects, where everybody was working together to achieve this bigger goal. But on the other hand, well, the same companies were struggling to free up capacity for being ready once the vaccines was ready to produce massively. And that this kind of clarity that we saw in the early stages of the development, we could not see it in the operational side. And the same for governments. Governments were super aligned in we need to get the vaccine. What can we do? How can we help? And then I think they didn't expect the vaccine to be there so quickly, so they were not prepared. They didn't have that kind of project management approach for the delivery of the vaccines and making sure that everybody had yeah, the needed shot. So you've seen that come back afterwards with the US very strongly, the UK very strongly, but they were not prepared, amazingly. So I think it has shown the great things that projects can do, but also if you don't take care of the second part in a project management approach, everything can fall up very quickly.
Now, I love what you just said. Really, the example we have for our governments across the globe is that project management piece for getting the vaccines in the hands of people and utilizing that. How else have you seen governments learn to build new templates for crisis management?
Well, to be honest, Janice, I think I've not seen that so far. I think there's still time for reflection, and I hope
Mhm.
we had the time of reflections as things are moving fast so quickly. I've not seen really governments already thinking of how can we avoid the next big crisis. I think they're still struggling to get over this one. So for me, it's more a call for attention than, I don't
Mhm.
know, hopefully in 6 months, in a year, governments, leaders, organizations, I think have been heavily impacted, can think ahead and be prepared for another big crisis, which, as we've seen, it's also a big opportunity. So, getting ready for the next big crisis, it should be seen as a big opportunity too, like we've seen with the Amazons and so on. They were really prepared and they really, yeah, rode this huge wave. We're still benefit from that. So I think this is a great opportunity to, yeah, think about the world in a very different way and about our businesses in a different way. So I'm really excited. This is really sad what happened, and it's really painful to see the numbers. But on the other hand, let's look at the positive side and see about the future, and see how projects can become a core part of businesses and core part of our professional lives. I think that will help a lot.
You know, I loved what you said about reflection and that hopefully we'll have more time as organizations and governments to reflect. So, tell me in an example of how you would suggest an organization or a government would look at that from a project management standpoint. How do you get reflection points from every level of an organization for looking for blind spots? How could we have improved this? How do you start approaching that?
Well, I think it's breaking a bit the habits that you have into your day-to-day routine. I think it's very important, really, to don't go over this. I think companies will be happy to have gone through this wave and coming back, but I think that kind of offsite, or you usually have an upside to think about strategy, right? Where people get outside the business to look at the future, I would recommend that the offsites that companies and leaders have in the next 6 to 12 months, they do a reflection backwards. They see what did we learn here? Don't think about the future. The future is going to change every 6 months now. So think about the past and see what did we learn? What did we do right? What can we do different? What if this happens again? How can we be ready? How can we have our plan B ready? Not just wait a few weeks or months, but be ready on the spot and take the opportunity. So I would kind of, my view is the next strategic offsite is a backward reflection.
So I'm going to pivot for just a minute and let you speak to that prolonged stress and anxiety that we've had over the past year. And how has that affect our discipline? Has it weakened us or hardened us? What have you seen in decision making across the board?
I think we saw great decision making right after the pandemic and when people went into confinement and couldn't go to work. I think that kind of period of a week or 2 3 weeks, I've seen the best decision making in many cases where they had to extreme prioritize things at work and what do we need to drop and what do we need to stop and where are the 2 3 things that we need to focus and I want the best people on this. Usually you would see half of the time people working part-time or 10% of their time. Here I think the extreme prioritization and putting the best teams around the most important projects to just get a survival. Don't go into too deep into the crisis and come out strongly. For me, that's, I think, great. I've never seen that urgency and that clarity on decision making. Then what happens is that this kind of drops, and people don't have that clarity where taking decisions where they want to see the business next. What do we do with our strategy towards working from home or not? There's still the doubts and the lack of clarity and I would say courage to make decisions. You don't have it anymore. So I think this is an important part of generating stress. I I think most people don't mind when there needs to be a big workaround or we need to work extra to save the company or do whatever. But what people cannot stand is this kind of uncertainty where there's no direction or every week there's new rules or changes in the strategy. So I think that's where I'm worried that we miss the opportunity to keep doing what we did right, and that leaders keep keeping that clarity on decision making, on focus. Because when companies focus, people focus. And yes, you can have a lot of work, but you know where you're going, you know where you're contributing, you know what are the top projects. So that kind of helps. You can take some time off, but you know that the team will be working. But I'm afraid we're not there yet, Janice.
No, I love what you pointed out, and I hope that everyone's really hearing that is that the good things that have come out of this and the vice it's created, that grip on us has created some sort of innovation around decision making and crisis management, and that we need to learn from that and not put that aside and go back to the way things were or to a default, that this becomes part of a new system. The other thing I want you to speak more to, because you intimated it earlier, is the positive side of what's happened through this. So, what other good things have you seen come out of this crisis and project management?
Well, I think the one of the great lessons is that we can collaborate with competitors. We can convince regulators that there's a bigger purpose than just making money, that we can do bigger thing in our projects. It could be sustainability, it could be employees, it can be social good, it can be diversity. So I think we can learn from this and say, well, regulators are usually very tough, but remember with the COVID vaccine, you were a team player. We were partners. So how can we change regulation out to be partners? Of course, we care about protection of safety and consumer, but let's work on this more on a partnership level. And competitors, why not if the cost is bigger? Clients and customers and also government. So I think this is For me, when I talk about projects, I see these type of projects. I think these projects that change the world, that can be done in 10% of the time that you could imagine. When everybody push and works together to that, and you could do anything. We could do anything in this world if we take the same approach. Absolutely. We want to eradicate poverty, we can. We want to clean all the oceans, we can. We can want to go to Mars, we can. We can. But we just need to get our line in the same way, and then projects will help you to get there.
That is really wonderful, and that is very encouraging for those who need to hear that, and that we can't give up on larger scale initiatives like this. I want you to, because I read the post recently and it was really interesting to me, Antonio. You talked about the European Super League as an example for how not to do a project. So I want you to walk me through that if you could before we close. I think that's a great story to share with people.
Yeah, sure. So a bit of background. Here in Europe, we play soccer and football, and that's our sport. Like in the US, you have NFL and so on. So the bigger clubs, they said, well, we don't need all the smaller clubs. Let's make a league. Imagine you have the top 10 teams in the NFL and say, forget about the others. We just get together and we play many times against each other. The Dallas Cowboys and the others play a second league. So it was a very sensitive topic. And from a project management perspective, it might be a business rationale for that. The crisis has impacted heavily all these sports and clubs. But the way they presented, the way they communicated, the rationale, the buying of the stakeholders, there was no buying of even the people working for the teams or supporting the teams were against. Imagine. So I think everything was done in that project, which maybe I'm not sure, but maybe there was a good rationale, financial rationale. But sports is more a heart thing. You use the heart, it's the people emotion. So you need to be extremely sensitive when you touch people's emotions, that you have assess what they're looking, what's in it for them, why such a project would be beneficial for the millions of fans around the world. And then, of course, you have the people who are left out of this super league, and they say, well, they're going to react heavily. So it's like everything was done wrong. There was no plan B, communication terrible. So if you want to look for a project that you should never do, just look into this one because it's fascinating. There were big firms behind, big firms, big people, very smart, but obviously if you don't know the basics of projects, you're going to fail. And this is just another example. There's many like
There are
this one.
many examples. No, and I thank you for that. And if you want to learn more about what he's talking about in his book, The Project Revolution, about his project canvas is phenomenal. And what he's speaking to is really that part where you take all the stakeholders into account. You can have the best project management in the world, and implement this great project, but it involves people. We can't forget the people. So it's part of the
Exactly.
project. The other great news is that Antonio is publishing a book in October through Harvard Business Review about project management. So look for that. You can find him at AntonioNietoRodriguez.com. And hopefully that will be up on the screen for you to see. And thank you, Antonio, so much for your time. And I've enjoyed speaking with you as always. Thank you for helping us project manage the world, really, what you've done the last year.
Thank you, Jenny. It's always a pleasure to work with Methods and the team. It's an amazing team. So I hope people like what we and get that call for action. I think the future is in our hands. Thank you, Janice.